From time to time, when I'm doing work with Meister Eckhart, something surprises me. And it might surprise you to learn that Plato's doctrine of remembrance, so anamnesis, the idea that we don't actually learn new things, we just remember them, that you actually find this in Eckhart in a surprising way. And it has to do with the ideas of unknowing, but then also of truth as something revealed. Truth has a very strange etymology. So the word aletheia in ancient Greek actually referred to an unforgetting. The word itself means unforgetting. It could also mean an unconcealing or, an unhiding. But the word, so if we break it apart, aletheia, so and then lethe. So lethe as in the river. So the river of oblivion, the river of forgetting. So this is specifically a river that you are put into to forget your previous life, to make a soul ready for metempsychosis and reincarnation in another life. That was a really surprising thing to me to encounter this. Okay, wow. What Plato was doing with the doctrine of remembrance was actually very much in line with the Greek conception of how it is that souls moved between lives and between bodies. And this is the sort of thing that with lethe in particular is very interesting. And it was curious to see that it was actually part of the word. Well, what was even stranger was to notice that in Eckhart, we get some very consistent imagery that is along Platonic lines. That is not surprising, but along Platonic lines, specifically with respect to the doctrine of remembrance. Anamnesis is something that most people look at as a kind of curiosity and say, okay, well, Plato, that's kind of wacky. What do we do with this idea? We don't learn anything, really. We just remember them. And then they look at the example with the slave boy and the Meno, and oftentimes people are not very convinced by that example. Is Socrates just asking him leading questions so that when he does the geometry example, the diagram there, that, he's kind of leading him toward the answer in some way where he's not actually remembering it? That's the charge that we frequently get against Plato and Socrates. And so I thought it was kind of surprising to see that Eckhart's metaphorics were very consistent in actually pointing in the direction of anamnesis. So let's check this out. So in Sermon 101, so this is the first Christmas sermon that we've talked a lot about, he says, we must forget images. And so the more completely you're able to draw in your powers to a unity and forget all those things and their images which you have absorbed, the further you can get from creatures and their images, and the nearer you are to the divine, and readier to receive it. Okay, so all of that is very canonical for Eckhart in the sense that images get in the way. We get this in Sermon 2, that images get in the way for us. They are a hindrance, and attachment to images gets in the way for us. Attachment to anything gets in the way for us, which is why detachment is what he recommends as the highest virtue. So that's not that surprising, but he couches it specifically in terms of forgetting, saying that we must forget those things. So the idea is something like this. When we have images that we are polluting our minds with, that they are hindrances that prevent us from seeing the divine stillness and purity and oneness that is God's being, that is at the ground of all of our beings, and the spark of the soul, the something, etc., etc. And that's all well and good, but to talk about it specifically as a forgetting is very interesting. Now, there is a tradition that goes alongside this, not just of forgetting, but of unlearning, of unknowing. And the idea is that we must go through a kind of progressive unknowing and unlearning of what we have learned in all conceivable ways to return to the originary state of innocence, of purity, of divinity. Well, the mind of a child, which is kind of interesting in the sense of, and I'm thinking in particular of the Zen notion of the beginner's mind here. And so if we are able to present things where they are, right here, right now, they are not so much processed and made the form of habit. And so I'm thinking of Heidegger in particular here, right? So we have different modes of being, and we can go into Heidegger later, but the idea is something like this. There are certain objects that we encounter in the world that we just have so well habituated that we don't even see them. We don't even think about them. And even when we do see them, we see them in terms of what we can do with them, and we see them in terms of the habits. So arguably, and this is one of the things that I like pointing out to my students, is that virtually everything in a classroom is there to try and make you not notice the classroom. So the classroom itself is composed of objects and common things that you should already have so much in the way of habit for that you don't have to think about it at all. Now, that may also have the corresponding unintended consequence of creating a very boring space that presents nothing that we have to think about. And so it's something that presents nothing that is actually catalytic for the mind. And so we have to then look to the lecture or look to whatever else is going on, either frequently with other students, what we have on our desks, or what the professor is saying, to get some kind of interest in mental activity there. Now, is that better? I don't know. I mean, some of us, myself included, it's nice to do class outside sometimes. So there's that, which is really kind of extraneous to what we're doing here. But nevertheless, okay, so forgetting and unlearning. So in Sermon 102, we get some of the same kind of thing. So this is the second Christmas sermon. Forgetting is associated there with stillness and divine silence. He says, hiding away from all images and forms, God can get to work. Here he must come to a forgetting, the person can get to work. Here he must come to a forgetting and an unknowing. And so those two then are juxtaposed and linked together, and says that there must be a stillness and silence for the word to make itself heard. So this is the capax Dei. This is the capacity for God, the capacity to receive God that Eckhart refers to throughout his works. And that capacity to receive is an openness to the divine, which can only happen when we are separated from that which is foreign to us. In other words, when we have gotten rid of those things, which we have dropped those things, detached from those things that are a hindrance to us. So that's what's happening there. Sermon 103, similarly, for you to know God in God's way. So that in itself is kind of interesting. So knowing God as God knows God, rather than knowing God as we think about God. Your knowing must become a pure unknowing and a forgetting of yourself in all creatures. So once again, linked with unknowing. And this was the part that, the light started to go on, and it was like, wow, there's something interesting happening here with what Eckhart is saying with unknowing, unlearning. That, I mean, I was familiar with that with, for instance, Didacta Ignorantia with Nicholas of Cusa. So on learned ignorance and the tradition of learned ignorance and unknowing in Christian theology. So that was familiar. And as a portion of a mystical itinerary, we can think of a progression towards divine oneness, towards mysticism, as happening by stripping away layers of conception, by stripping away things that put us at a distance from the oneness of God, that put us at a distance from mystical oneness. In other words, that any kind of differentiation, any kind of distinction, if we can slowly unravel that and take those things apart. In other words, we could think of that as unlearning them, or in this case, as forgetting them. So we've learned the distinctions in the past, and now we must forget what we have learned, so to be able to approach the divine. That's fascinating in a certain way, but it is precisely the sort of thing that provides a foil to, or not really a foil, but I mean, it draws a kind of obvious comparison to Plato's anamnesis. Knowing the depth to which Eckhart is Platonic and Neoplatonic specifically, we should really question what the role of anamnesis is in his thought, and how he conceives of remembering, and then how he conceives of forgetting. And so for Plato, remembering is a knowledge. And so we come to knowledge, which presumably takes us up the hierarchy into the forms. And so one would have to begin by a certain amount of knowing, of conceptual knowing, but then to go beyond that and actually proceed to the good. Plato's a little light on the details of what happens after we have, some knowledge of mathematics, after we have a knowledge of the forms, and then how do we get to the good? How do we get to the originary, the father of all the forms, for which all the forms are children of the good? He says this in the Republic. How do we do that? It's understood that that's philosophy. That's what we're supposed to be doing. I mean, Plato's Academy famously said, there was an inscription over the doorway we hear, let no one enter who has not studied geometry. So at the very beginning, you have to know math. You have to already have some knowledge of the forms. Well, presumably Plato's going to help you to know some of the other forms, the higher forms, and then to push toward the good. But wait, the good is divine unity. And if the good is divine unity, then we have to shed those other layers of knowing, which means that even if anamnesis is a remembering and that accomplishes a knowing, which pushes us up the hierarchy, at a certain point, we have to unknow what it is that we've learned to be able to get to the oneness, which is the good. So it makes sense, even in Plato's system, it's just not talked about very much. But with Eckhart, of course, he's going to be talking about it all the time. And so we get this in grand style in Eckhart. So again, with this series of sermons, so number 104, Do we have to exert ourselves to forget all things and be aware of the eternal birth alone? So repetition of the same image. Again, with Sermon 58, this is all over the place. There, the soul forgets herself in all things as she is in herself and knows herself divinely, in as far as God is in her, and insofar as she loves herself divinely in him and is united with him without distinction. So she enjoys and rejoices in nothing but him. So it's the same thing again, where the soul is to forget herself, to forget all things. So this goes even further, right? So this isn't just forgetting all things and all conception, but also forgetting yourself. So this is the, kenotic moment of self-emptying. So continuing, Sermon 11, he's famous for saying all creatures are a pure nothing, because anything that is differentiated is going to be at a distance from God. Things that are a distance from God, that's precisely what it means for something not to be. And so distinction is itself a kind of nothing. So that's how that works. That's not as surprising, but he goes on from this and says, all creatures are pure nothing. That which is not here or there and is a forgetting of all creatures embraces the fullness of all being. Okay, well, creatures are a pure nothing, which means that we need to forget all creatures to not be here or there. So all creatures, and then here or there, we're referring to any kind of spatiality, right? So any notion of space and place. So that has to be dropped as well and has to be forgotten. Continuing, Sermon 68. Sometimes I say if the soul is to know God, she must forget herself and lose herself. For if she were aware of herself, she would not be aware of God, but she finds herself again in God. Okay, now this brings full circle what it was that was begun in Sermon 11. So in Sermon 11, the soul has to forget all creatures. Sermon 58. The soul forgets all creatures and the soul forgets herself. Remember, the soul, the word for soul is feminine. That's why it's constantly her. So the soul forgets herself, but then we're told in Sermon 68 that she finds herself again in God. In other words, there is this strange yo-yo motion of we not only forget all things and unlearn all things, we unlearn and forget ourselves and then find ourselves again in God. Now, it's not clear here if that's just in divine being or if there's some sense in which the individual substantively persists to that point. That's not clear from this passage. He does other things in different places. But okay, so moving on from there, and this is going to reach an apex with the Book of Divine Consolation, so that's coming. In Sermon 74, he says, what is mine, I have to forget in all things. If you can forget what is yours, then you will gain virtue. Now here, we're talking about mine and yours and possession, and that is having, which, if you may recall, in Sermon 52 was the last stage. So you had Sermon 52 is Beate Pauperis Spiritus. That's his most famous sermon. And that proceeds according to the progression where, you start with the Franciscans in willing and loving, and then you move on to the Dominicans in knowing, and then you move on to Eckhart. And that last stage is possession. So Eckhart is going to recommend a detachment from a, depossessing. So dropping of a letting go of possession. And that's what's referred to here, which is kind of interesting. So what is mine, I have to forget in things. So in other words, as a part of forgetting, it's not just the images that I'm dropping, but it's also the attachment to all things that I'm dropping. So that's curious. Now, this is kind of funny. In Sermon 64, this is a passage that many people notice because it sounds interesting, but you may not have noticed what it says specifically about forgetting. So he says, I will tell you how I think of people. I try to forget myself and everyone and merge myself for them in unity. Now, that's really curious in terms of, what does Eckhart actually do when he meets someone? What does he do when he's ministering to someone? To what degree is he bathed in the divine and present mystically in the divine when he's talking with another person? How does he approach another person? And so that's a serious question. It's an interesting question. It's a very practical question for a minister. And then also here, I try to forget myself and everyone emerge into unity. It's expected, but at the same time, it's vivid and interesting. So in Sermon 84, and now we get something more of a specific, an explicit itinerary. It says, the soul takes 4 steps into God. The first is that fear, hope, and desire grow in her. Again, she steps on, and then fear and hope and desire are quite cut off. At the third stage, she comes to a forgetfulness of all temporal things, so dropping of things. But then at the fourth stage, she enters into God, where she will eternally dwell. Now, we get this with different numbers of stages in different places in Eckhart. But the idea that this forgetting takes us all the way up to the doorstep of the divine, that's present throughout. That's something that is a commonplace in his writings and his thought. And so it's curious that this forgetting is the kind of last thing that we do before we, attain mystical unity with God, which that makes sense, right? I mean, if you look at the anamnesis of Plato and the, kind of progression that I mentioned before, where you learn things and you come to remember things with the forms via anamnesis, but then eventually you have to forget those and get back to divine oneness with the good. That's what we're getting here, is that last stage is forgetfulness. So this unlearning and this forgetting is really, really curious. And specifically, again, I mentioned this in the context of aletheia, because this is, remember, aletheia is the ancient Greek word for truth. And so as a not forgetting, a truth is something that is learned, that is revealed, that is unforgotten. But what this means is, for Eckhart and for Plato, that we have to eventually go beyond truth. And I've argued that before. It's not something that, frequently people have this kind of, it's almost as though Socrates fetishizes truth. I don't think that's true. That's only a stage, and that stage is part of learning the forms. But like I said, that can't be the last stage, because he identifies the good, and the good is divine unity, from which all the other forms descend. And so learning the forms and remembering things, that can't be where you stop. There has to be something else, and the something else involves a kind of paradoxical reverse motion of forgetting. So I think that's really, interesting, and that's what we get here as well. So now, finally, with the sermons, in Sermon 79, one of the saints has said, "I sometimes experience such sweetness in me that I forget myself and all creatures, and wish to dissolve right into thee," into God. "But when I want to seize it, Lord, you snatch it from me. Why do you do this? What do you mean by this? Well, if you would entice me, if you're teasing me with this joy, why do you take it from me?" Now, that's funny, because so Walsh, and this is taking a page out of Quint. So Quint was the guy who wrote the critical edition for this and assembled all the manuscripts. And one of his notes says that this is a free rendering of Augustine's Confessions 10.40. And that the rest, he says, is based on Confessions 1.1, but is Eckhart's own. In other words, he kind of goes off and does his own thing with it, which is really interesting. But this is something that you don't hear as much about in Christianity, but it's all the time in Buddhism, where if I experience the bliss that accompanies a, kind of foray initially into meditation, the first stage is bliss. And the idea is, frequently people experience the bliss of one-pointed concentration, where I finally, been able to sort of quiet the mind, something that you can't really do intentionally, because then you get attached to the process of quieting it, and you're attached to that, and you still don't get settled down. And so settling down is really hard. Once you do, though, and attain a one-pointed concentration, the rush is not boredom, as many people assume wrongly. It's bliss. It's very enjoyable. It's this rush of, here is what it's like finally not to worry about stuff. This is what it's like not to have regret in the past, anxiety for and hope for the future, and concern with whatever's happening at the present moment. At this point, all care is dropped. All concern is dropped, and this is what it's like to live in that. And by the way, it's really enjoyable. But famously, this is the sort of thing that you can't hold on to for long, because as soon as you see it, people grasp for it and say, "Oh, I want to keep this because it is so comprehensively enjoyable that I want to be able to hold on to this, throughout." And as soon as you grab for it, you lose it. And that's what he's talking about here, is when I want to seize it, when I want to grasp it, you snatch it from me. And this is in a Christian context. So anyway, it's interesting to see. It's just human psychology. It's the same stuff that's being experienced in different traditions. But it's funny to see that here. Okay, now, finally, we have the piece from the Book of Divine Consolation. This is really interesting. So this is from section 2 of the Book of Divine Consolation. "If a man might and knew how to make a cup completely empty and keep it empty of whatever might fill it, even air, assuredly the cup would lose and forget its own nature, and emptiness would bear it aloft. it would forget its own nature. Eckhart does some strange things with metaphors sometimes, and the would I metaphor is such a bizarre one. He talks about a painting that if we could remove the wall and it was just hanging in midair, that kind of thing. And this is another one, a cup. A cup would forget its own nature? What does that even mean, And so that invites us to go beyond just the conception of interiority with individuals, but also to consider this for everything, for the form of anything, and for any possible distinct thing, if it were even presumably the most prosaic element, which is, I imagine that's why he chose a cup, right? It's something everybody has familiarity with, but it's just a thing, and it's always just kind of a thing. And saying that it would lose and forget its own nature, that's fascinating. And specifically, of course, that the emptiness would bear it aloft. As you know, those who are fond of Buddhism, emptiness, shunyata, is a big concept in Buddhism, and so, or a big idea, a common theme. I had to stop myself when I said concept. It's like, well, it's not really a concept. But anyway, so it's something that gets mentioned a lot in Buddhism, and it's of great utility. And arguably that kind of thing is seen here as well, which is funny because it's both a physical emptiness, and that may be partially of what he's part of what he's referring to. But surely also it's not just a physical emptiness, because the emptiness bearing it aloft cannot be a physical emptiness. It has to be something more comprehensive in terms of a divine nothing. So I think that's what we get there. And he goes on and says, I therefore say that likeness born of one draws the soul to God, just as he is in hidden unity. For that is the meaning of one. So hidden unity, this secret or hidden unity. Often that word can be translated as either one. And that is the meaning of one. We have a visible symbol of this. When material fire burns wood, a spark receives the nature of fire and becomes like that pure fire which exists immediately below heaven. And so this is this notion of the ancient cosmology where you had, earth, air, fire, and water. And so you're kind of going up with, earth, water, and then air, and then fire, because fire, no matter what it is that you light, it immediately goes up. So, you start burning something and the thing immediately goes up. And the thought was that things have a tendency to go where they belong. So earth, you drop it and it goes down because earth belongs down, water belongs down, but then can evaporate and go up, and air kind of, settles up above earth and water, but then fire is the highest because anything that you set on fire goes up and apparently just keeps going. And the idea is that you have this shell, and outside of the shell is a kind of fire, and there are little holes poked in the shell, and you can see those at night because those are the stars. And so that's what he's referring to here with the fire that is outside of it. So immediately below heaven. He goes on and says, all at once it forgets and renounces father and mother, brother and sister on earth, and shoots up to its heavenly Father. Okay, this is really interesting because forgetting and renouncing, denying father, mother, brother, sister, and then of course itself as well, we're wont to say, and he easily could have mentioned. This is Luke 14:26. Now, he mentions this in the Christmas sermon, in Sermon 101. That is the passage where Christ said, he who does not hate his father, his mother, his wife, his child, and yea, even his own life too, cannot be my disciple. That's a tough passage for a lot of people because it seems like, okay, not only do I not need to love the people that I'm most inclined to love and the things that I am the most attached to, but that I actually have to actively hate and get separation. How do we make sense of that? This is the same kind of thing. Again, all at once it forgets and renounces father and mother, sister, brother and sister on earth, and shoots up to its heavenly Father. So to renounce or to deny, that is another way of translating the word that can also be translated as hate. And so we get that as well in Eckhart's version. So in other words, when Eckhart speaks about Luke 14:26 in German, he actually says a word that could be translated as deny. So this is clearly meant to be the same kind of thing. And the denial and renunciation is mentioned alongside forgetting, which is natural, right? In this conversation, in what it is that we're doing here, talking about going beyond and forgetting the attachment to all the corporeal things, that even something when it's set on fire forgets its earthly nature and then goes up to it's nice. It's a nice visual for this, as he says. Okay. And he says, the father of the spark, and it's not a coincidence that we're talking about a spark, right, with Eckhart's divine spark. And so for more on that, check out the analysis of Sermon 2, because I talked about that in more detail there. The father of the spark here below is the fire. The mother is the wood. Its brother and sister are the other sparks. And for these, the first spark will not wait. It shoots up quickly to its true father who is heaven. For whoever knows the truth knows well that the fire as fire is not a real true father of the spark. And so it goes beyond and up and on to God himself. The real true father of the spark is all that is fiery is heaven. Further, it's important to note that the little spark not only leaves and forgets father and mother, brother and sister on earth, it also leaves and forgets and abandons itself. See, there you go. Abandons itself in its urgent desire to get to its true father, heaven, for it is bound to be quenched by the cold air and yet wants to give proof of the natural love it bears for its real heavenly father. Okay, so that I think is fascinating in the sense that now we can connect forgetting, unlearning, and unknowing to the denial, renunciation, and hate that we see in Luke 14:26. And so that's how we should understand, in other words, the renunciation of one's father, mother, sister, brother, wife, and even child. That's the kind of thing that we should understand as a forgetting, an unlearning, and an unknowing, which is necessary to be able to return to mystical union with divine oneness. So it all makes a great deal of sense. It's just, that's the reason that's such a hard passage, right? Is because it's more explicitly mystical in the sense that this pretty clearly refers to a mysticism, which is not the easiest thing in the world for people. So you don't get that very much, unfortunately, in sermons or in general, in talking with people. So, okay. So I hope that's helpful. Now, we can continue on with the Book of Divine Consolation. He has a passage where he says, water flows downward of its own nature. Its being resides in that. Remember, it flows to where its natural place is. And he says, yet through the impress and influence of the moon in the sky, it abandons and forgets its own nature, flowing upstream and upward. And this affliction is easier for it than the downflow. In other words, the moon is a higher thing, literally, physically higher, but also spiritually higher. It is a higher thing, and it has an influence on water that can cause it to flow the wrong direction, so that it doesn't just go to where its natural place is, that the moon actually pulls the water up. They're familiar with the tides. I mean, this is this is what he's talking about there. And so that was very current for his day. But it's an interesting idea that something that above can affect the nature of what is below, and temporarily it forgets its own nature and flows against where it is not naturally inclined to go. So that's kind of fascinating. Now, I want to end this discussion with a passage from On the Nobleman. We haven't talked about this work very much so far, but it's fascinating. And this is where we have another of the mystical itineraries. Again, it's not 4 stages here. He has 6 and more. So he says, the 6th stage is when a man is deformed and transformed by God's eternity and has attained total forgetfulness of transitory temporal life and is drawn and translated into a divine image, having become the child of God. Beyond this, there is no higher stage. So once again, forgetting is the final stage. So that's it. That's the thing that he was trying to get to. The forgetting is the last stage before divine oneness. And anyway, this gives you an idea of just how important the idea of forgetting, of unlearning and unknowing is for Eckhart, that it takes you to the kind of doorstep of the divine, so to speak. So I hope that helps. It was surprising to me to see the connection with Plato's anamnesis, but I think it's productive and interesting in a certain way and can open some doors in terms of understanding things for Plato as well. So I hope it helps. I hope it's good to think with.